this quick video is going to be about fabric simulations. And I would say that the fabric simulations can be some of the most finicky, but generally they are the easiest. So to run a fabric simulation, it's pretty simple. I'm actually just going to add a plane into the scene, and this plane is going to become our fabric. So for this demo, what I'm going to do is I'm going to really quickly kind of mess this cube up, and then I'm going to drape this fabric over it and have it form to this cube. So when I say mess it up, I'm just going to enter into edit mode. I'm going to subdivide it just a little bit. Then I'm going to go into sculpt mode really quickly, just kind of blob it around a bit and maybe just really gunk it up. Yeah, that's much nicer to gunk it up. And so after I've done that, I'm just going to apply a remesh to it, and let's do blocks. Perfect. Now I want to drape the fabric over top of this, and so in a similar way, before I do anything to this, I'm going to subdivide this fabric sheet. So I'm going to enter into edit mode for this sheet and subdivide it. The more subdivisions you have on your plane, the higher resolution your fabric simulation will be. So I'm actually going to subdivide it a few times. I'm going to subdivide it like this, and you'll see I have about 30,000 faces or edges in the scene, about 15,000 faces. I can maybe subdivide this one more time, but I'm not going to push it to 10. I'm just going to go to 2. So this is a very high resolution plane. You can experiment with the resolution on this, but you'll see exactly what it's going to do right now. So I'm actually going to go with the plane selected into the Physics Properties tab, and then I'm just going to select Cloth. Now this will look pretty similar to some of the other simulation types if you've looked at any of those, but in this one, the main features we want to pay attention to are things like the quality steps, and then down at the bottom we can turn things on like collisions and adjust the quality of the simulation of the collision, and we can affect the field weights. But with the fabric physics set added to the plane, I'm actually just going to hit the play button, and I'm just using the default layout here in Blender, and it has this really handy timeline down at the bottom, and you can either click play or you can hit the space bar. And if you hit the space bar, you'll see it is beginning to simulate. And I'm going to actually stop it because of a couple of things. One, I noticed that this is taking a very, very long time. And so to get around that, I'm actually going to unsubdivide my plane. I just Control Z to undo a few times, so I could just tell that was going way too slowly. Also, before I run the simulation, I need to make sure that my object has a collision, and so I've added so to do that, I just got to click my object and add the collision modifier. And just leaving on the default settings is what we're going to try to begin with, but we could adjust some of these different properties if we want. So I'm going to reapply the cloth modifier here, and I'm just going to hit the play button, and you watch as it is simulating the fabric falling, because gravity is innately in the scene by default. And that looks pretty decent. You'll notice that it's not the highest resolution, and that's purely because of the subdivision level of the fabric. If it was higher subdivision level, it would be much smoother. And similarly, if I had increased the resolution of the collision setting, it would not have phased through the object at all. It would have draped more seamlessly around it. But that said, this is actually pretty interesting. I could go ahead and bake this, but I'm going to edit this simulation a little bit more. And I'm going to do that by adding in some forces to the scene. And to add forces to the scene, I'm just going to go to Add, and here are the various force fields. So there are some really interesting ones. a force by default is essentially like gravity. So if I want something to compete with gravity, I could, for example, put it up above and then turn its strength to a negative value. If I do that, the net force will be less. So that's one way to lower gravity. Another way to affect the amount of gravity is here in the your object, which is turning into fabric, in the field weight setting. So if I slide this bar of gravity all the way down, now when I hit play, only this force in the scene is affecting the object. And it's a pretty mild force, so you couldn't even tell it was moving there. I would have had to simulate it much longer. But I'm going to leave gravity on because I actually want it to drape. And I'm going to delete this force, but I'm going to add in, you see there's a bunch of different kinds. I'm going to add in a turbulence force. And turbulence is a fantastic kind of force. You can play, of course, with any of the types here and see what they do, but the turbulence is going to add some randomness to the equation. So when I put the turbulence in, it will help twist it up a little bit. Now, the turbulence is pretty low in the scene, so if I really want it to make an impact, I'll move it up closer to the fabric to begin with. And I'll give it some scale as well. So I'm just editing the details, the physics properties of the turbulence force by having it selected and looking at its physics properties. I didn't drastically change the operation, but it looks slightly different, I think. Now, probably the most obvious force to watch in action is the vortex. If I really increase the strength on it, you'll watch as the vortex kind of sucks it in a spiral, but I'm not going to do that this time. You, of course, can play around with any combination of these things. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to let this simulation run, and I'm going to let it run to about here. And what I'm going to do is I am going to apply that cloth modifier. That essentially freezes the simulation. So now it'll be much lighter in the scene because it's no longer a simulation. It's just a frozen object. And that will allow us to do a few things. Namely, it will allow us to smooth it really easily, but it will also be able to give it some thickness. So I'm going to add a solidify modifier, and you can see the solidify modifier is giving the original plane a bit of thickness. So I'm going to make it a bit thinner than that, though. Add another 0 in there. Maybe even thinner than that. And now I'm going to add a subdivision surface modifier. And the subdivision surface modifier is one you have to be quite careful with because it does rapidly smooth things, but it does also rapidly increase the polygon count in the scene. So save often. And you'll see you can raise and lower for the viewport level and the render level. So if your computer is going slow, you can keep the render level high, but just have it a bit lower in the scene. Now this is looking pretty nice. I actually don't even mind necessarily that the object is kind of poking out, but I could also just hide the object now. And now it's more about that implied form that would be under the fabric than the actual thing itself. And if we go in and look at rendering this, solve this really quickly, swap into cycles, and adjust my lighting. So I just put a sun with the power of 10, black background, and there we go, a nice ghostly sheet. And you can run the fabric simulations over characters and over just about anything. And of course you can even sculpt this form afterwards, right? So it's pretty flexible. I think you'll find too, if you start digging into more specific uses of the fabric simulation, you can do things like pin points onto characters or onto people or objects, so that, for example, if you had a flag, you could pin the fabric to the flag so it could blow in the wind. But I'm just going to really quickly apply this modifier stack by going to Object, Apply, Visual Geometry to Mesh, and I'm just going to go into Sculpt mode. And now, of course, we can just even smooth it out farther. if that's what you're going for. And you can still see some of the polygons on it. And to get around that, you might even remesh and continue that process to smooth it out perfectly. But that's the quick version of the fabric simulations.